Alright, that leads us then into bias. What exactly is bias? Bias is a systematic error in measuring the estimate. If you're always making the same error when you're measuring your estimate, that is bias. It favors certain outcomes. And when I think about bias, just think about it's anything that causes the data to be wrong. If you're drawing the wrong conclusion and there's something that's causing that to happen, that's bias. It might be attributed to the researchers. They could have designed it wrong. It could be the respondent. He could be lying, or it could be the sampling method, which is basically surveying the wrong people. That's what bias is. There are many sources of bias. These are things that can cause the bias in your sample. And remember that bias is bad. You can't do anything with bad data. If you have bad data, everything you're going to do with it is going to be wrong. So you can't do anything with bad data, and that's why we spend so much time talking about how do you gather data, what's a good way to gather data versus a bad way to gather data. Because if you're getting bad data, everything is going to be screwed up. Okay, undercoverage is an example of bias. Undercoverage, some groups of the population are left out of the sampling process. So for example, suppose that you take a sample by randomly selecting names from the phone book. Well, some groups may not have the opportunity to be selected. For example, people with unlisted phone numbers, which are usually high-income families, people without phone numbers, which are usually low-income families, and people with only cell phones, which are usually young adults. So this is an example of undercoverage. Some groups are left out. Non-response occurs when an individual chosen for the sample can't be contacted or refuses to cooperate. This is my biggest one because I don't know about you guys, but I always get calls right at dinner asking me to complete a survey or take a survey or some sort of phone survey, and I always hang up on them because I just refuse to do it because it's right at dinner. I'm a classic example of non-response. They chose me, they called me, but I refuse to participate and I hang up on them. So that's an example of non-response. Don't get that confused with voluntary response. Remember, voluntary response is they choose to select themselves. They weren't randomly chosen. They chose to select themselves and they wanted to participate. Alright, telephone surveys, typically 70% non-response. It makes me feel better. I'm not the only person out there that hangs up on them. Alright, and because of the huge telemarketing efforts in the past few years, they always have a major problem with non-response, as evidenced by whenever they call me. Alright, one way to help with the problem of non-response is to make follow-up contact, and that's what they do. They keep calling you back time after time after time after time to try and get you to answer their survey, and I just hang up on them every time. Response bias. Response bias occurs when the behavior of the respondent or the interviewer causes bias in the sample. They give you wrong answers. So here's an example of how that could be response bias. Suppose we wanted to survey high school students on drug abuse. So we use a uniformed police officer to interview each student in our sample. Let's think about that. Are the students going to give you honest answers if they're being interviewed by a police officer in uniform? I don't think so. I don't think you're going to get honest answers. They're going to lie to you. So that's an example of response bias. It's caused by the uniformed police officer. Response bias occurs when for some reason, either the interviewer's or the respondent's fault, you get incorrect answers. The wording of the question can make a big deal. Wording can influence the answers in a big way. The connotation of the words, there's lots of different ways. Questions have to be worded as neutrally as possible in order to avoid influencing response. There are people that spend their entire career, that this is their job, is to come up with these questions, and they need to be very neutrally worded in order to avoid influencing the response. You have to try to avoid using big words or technical words. The level of vocabulary needs to be appropriate for the population that you're surveying. So for example, if you're surveying Podunk, Texas, you should avoid complex vocabulary. Trust me, I grew up in Texas and I'm well aware of that. As opposed to if you're surveying medical doctors, then you can use more complex technical wording because they have a lot of training and they're used to those things. So it's an example. You have to be very careful. Your wording should be tailored to your population. It's a nice little comic book. I just thought that was a little bit funny. So bias. Bias is the bane of sampling. It's the one thing above all that you must avoid. There's usually no way to fix a bias sample, and there's no way to salvage useful information from it. So the best way to avoid bias is to select individuals for the sample at random. And the value of deliberately introducing randomness is one of the great insights, one of the most important things we're going to talk about in statistics, is the value of randomness. Alright, so think about this. I want you to see what source of bias is this. Before the presidential election of 1936, which was FDR against the Republican Alf Landon, the magazine Literary Digest predicted Landon would win the election in a 3-2 victory. They did a survey of 2.8 million people. So Literary Digest surveyed 2.8 million people, and they predicted that Alf Landon would win. George Gallup, he only surveyed 50,000 people, but he predicted Roosevelt would win. Now, for those of you who are familiar with American history, which I hope is all of you, you know who won that election. I've never heard of Alf Landon, and I'm sure you haven't either. But FDR we all have heard about because he was a very famous president. So obviously George Gallup got it right, and Literary Digest got it wrong. Gallup only surveyed 50,000 people. Literary Digest surveyed 2.8 million. What did they do wrong? Well, the Digest survey came from magazine subscribers, car owners, telephone directories, and etc. This was an example of undercoverage. Since the Digest surveys comes from car owners, etc., these were people who were mostly high-income families, and therefore mostly Republican. And therefore they predicted they were all favoring Republicans.
That's all, folks!